Mr. President, I'm going to talk a little bit about the bill that we have been debating here all week on the Senate floor, the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson Honoring Our PACT Act of 2022. Now, it's a very important bill. It's named after Sergeant First Class Robinson, an Ohio National Guard soldier who died in 2020 as a result of service-connected toxic exposure. This bill that we're going to be voting for final passage on tomorrow would deliver immediate access to health care for toxic exposed veterans, direct the VA to evaluate diseases for presumption of service connection, and streamline the process for toxic exposed veterans seeking disability compensation for their illness that they gained while serving overseas defending our nation. Mr. President, I have supported the intent of this bill for years, and I intend to vote in favor of this bill tomorrow when it comes up for final passage. There is nothing in my mind that is more important than taking care of our veterans. But I do want to raise some concerns about how we got to this point, the process of this bill, which in my view undermine the likelihood of this massive new program being implemented in a way that benefits all American veterans, so we can take care of all American veterans. Let me explain. Since my time here in the Senate, I have focused on these issues. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee that was responsible in large measure for many aspects of this bill. I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I still serve in the military myself in the Marine Corps Reserves, and I am honored to represent the state in our great nation, Alaska, that has more veterans per capita than any state in the country. So veterans and military affairs and their families have been a core focus of mine since I arrived in the Senate in 2015. And in particular, Mr. President, I've been focused on this issue of toxic exposure of our servicemen and women during wartime. In fact, one of my commitments as a candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2014 was to work to ensure passage of the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act, which I co-sponsored when I got here and was signed into law in 2019. That was an outstanding commitment to our Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange during their time, but it was belatedly fulfilled years, even decades after their service in Vietnam. And Mr. President, I took lessons from that. As a matter of fact, I think many senators took lessons from that when the next generation of veterans served overseas and were exposed to toxins during their service, that we needed to act. So that's what I've done in my career here, Mr. President. I've worked taking the Vietnam veteran experience, particularly with Agent Orange, to make sure we don't repeat that. The mistakes of Agent Orange were those exposed to toxic substances overseas during their service and later came down with diseases and suffered, that we needed to take care of them. We know that toxic exposure during military service can add serious complications to a veteran's health, years and even decades after their service has concluded. And there is science that can correlate certain diseases and symptoms to exposure. That's the model that we want. Veterans suffering from potential exposure understand too well that getting the VA to even recognize and concede exposure can remain a challenging, bureaucratic, and incredibly frustrating process that leads to denials, often from the bureaucracy. So early in my time here, Mr. President, I have been a relentless advocate on these issues. I'll give you a few examples. I introduced with Senator Manchin of West Virginia the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act, which has previously passed out of committee in the Veterans Affairs Committee and enjoys broad bipartisan support. Close to half of the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, were co-sponsors of our bill, and almost all of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee was. This bill would recognize and concede exposure to toxic substances for those veterans who were deployed in areas where burn pits were in use, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, all of these different areas and more. This bill would do away with the paperwork that made it almost impossible to prove exposure by these veterans and put the onus on the VA and that bureaucracy. When crafting this bill with Senator Manchin, our offices worked extensively with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee and many of the veteran service organizations, particularly the Disabled American Veterans Organization. And we worked with the VA on the language to make sure we were not getting ahead of the science, making sure that what was exposed and what were the diseases connect with science. Not always easy, but the VA does have expertise in that area. I then co-sponsored with Senator Blumenthal the K2 Veterans Advocacy Act. This bill moved the needle on three things that are known systemically now. The toxic substances at the base that we called K2 in Uzbekistan, the medical conditions that K2 veterans have, and they're serious. Something really bad was going on at the K2 base in Uzbekistan, and the links between the two. Now, we worked with the Trump White House before President Trump left office in 2020, before our bill passed here on the Senate floor, to get them to issue an executive order for the VA to essentially do those things for K2 veterans. I introduced and had passed the bipartisan Burn Pits Accountability Act with Senator Klobuchar, which directs the Pentagon to include in periodic health assessments an evaluation of whether a service member has been exposed to open burn pits or toxic airborne chemicals in their deployments. This bill was included in the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. And I sponsored the Pandemic Care for Burn Pits Exposure Act of 2020 to ensure that service members and veterans with previous exposure to burn pits receive the care they needed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. President, I'm listing these bills and the work and time and the bipartisan nature of them because on the Veterans Affairs Committee, there has been no issue I've been more focused on. We are going to take the lessons from Vietnam, Agent Orange, and not say you're going to wait 3 or 4 or 5 decades while you die of cancer. And I am committed to this issue, and I have been. But I'm also committed to passing legislation that is worthy of all veterans that we are serving. So I have had some reservations about the current bill and the process by which it has come to the Senate floor, because the process has thwarted opportunities to make this a better bill, to make it serve our veterans in a better, holistic way. And again, this is an issue I've been focused on since my first days in the U.S. Senate. So what are the issues, Mr. President? Well, as I mentioned, some of the things in there, a lot of the things in this bill are very necessary. The bill that I just mentioned that I co-sponsored with Senator Manchin, the Veterans Burn Pits Exposure Recognition Act, was incorporated into the PACT Act that we will be voting on tomorrow, the Sergeant Robinson's Honoring Our PACT Act. In fact, many bipartisan bills from the Veterans Affairs Committee were included in the bill that we're going to be voting on tomorrow. But ultimately, what we had going on in the Veterans Affairs Committee was an agreement that when we brought this big bill, and it's big, to the Senate floor, we would have the ability to bring amendments to try to improve it, to try to make it better for all veterans and the entire VA system. A system that we know has challenges implementing sweeping mandates from Congress. And Mr. President, this is a sweeping mandate from Congress that we are voting on. As I mentioned, the issue of toxic exposure, which I have been focused on since my first year here in the U.S. Senate, has always been a bipartisan bill. The 4 bills I just mentioned that I've led on have all had Democrat co-sponsors, leading with me as well. But what happened this week and last week was the bipartisan nature of trying to tackle one of the biggest issues facing our veterans was shut down. For whatever reason, and I don't know why, somebody should ask the majority leader, all the amendments that we were going to bring to the floor to make this bill better were shut down. We have not had one amendment on this comprehensive bill, and like I said, Mr. President, a number of us have been focused on this issue for years. What were we trying to do with these amendments? We're trying to make this a better bill. Bring your ideas to the floor, debate them, vote on them. Why wouldn't we want to do that? Why wouldn't we want to do that? Don't we owe it to all of our veterans to do that? Mr. President, my primary concern, as I've mentioned, is making sure that not just the constituency impacted by this legislation, which we need, those exposed to toxic exposure, primarily from burn pits, are taken care of, but the whole VA system remains robust and strong. And I think some of the amendments, I know some of the amendments that we were going to bring, as a matter of fact, on the Veterans Affairs Committee, there was a commitment to make sure we were bringing these amendments to the floor, would have made this bill better. What are the biggest concerns? Well, I pressed the Secretary of the VA just yesterday in his testimony before the Veterans Affairs Committee on one of the biggest concerns I have, and one of the biggest concerns many senators have, and one of the biggest concerns our Veterans Affairs Committee has, and it's this. This bill that I will be supporting tomorrow is estimated to bring an additional 2.5 million claims to the VA. 2.5 million. My question to the Secretary was simple, but really important. Mr. Secretary, is the VA system ready to absorb the roughly 2.5 million additional claims that are likely to be generated in the next 3 years by the PACT Act? Are you ready? We have some ideas and amendments that we think can make it ready. But again, for whatever reason, the majority leader didn't want to hear about those. In an already stretched VA, with a huge backlog already, and challenges as we speak, the Secretary testified about them yesterday, about hiring qualified medical personnel across the country, but especially in my state, in Alaska. The concern that I raised with the Secretary yesterday, the concern that we were trying to address through an amendment process here on the Senate floor is this. You bring in that many into a system that's not ready, and you could collapse the whole system. You could collapse the whole system. And then every veteran loses. A young Marine with his legs amputated after an IED explosion in Afghanistan who needs help, he's going to be delayed. A Vietnam veteran who needs care, he's going to be delayed. A Gulf War veteran, she's going to be delayed. If you're collapsing the whole system, every veteran loses. Every veteran loses. Now, Mr. President, I've actually seen this in my state, and I know your state has had some challenges with the VA. Several years ago, I held a field hearing in Arizona on some of the challenges in the VA. But I've seen the system collapse in Alaska. In 2015, my first year in the U.S. Senate, due to legislation that had been passed the year before, we essentially had the system in Alaska collapse. Somehow, some way, legislation and ideas from the VA thought it was really smart to remove the ability to actually make appointments from veterans, for veterans in Alaska, not by officials from the VA who lived in Alaska, but somewhere in the lower 48. I think it was Louisiana or somewhere. Not a good idea. The whole system cratered. I've seen it. And no veteran benefits. No one benefits. My first year here in 2015, that was my #1 priority, get the VA to fix the broken system in Alaska. And we've made huge progress. But I've seen it firsthand when a system that is supposed to take care of veterans craters. Of course, every veteran suffers. So, we don't want that to happen with the implementation of this important bill. And the Secretary of the VA assured Senator Tillis in questioning yesterday that this won't happen, that the system won't be overburdened, that they are prepared for this. Well, I hope he's right. I have my doubts, but I hope he's right. But here's the point, Mr. President. A bipartisan amendment process, particularly from senators, I'll give you one example, Senator Moran, ranking member on Veterans Affairs, been working this issue like me for years, particularly from senators who actually know the issue. A bipartisan amendment process would have helped ensure that this possibility would be much less. I'll give you a couple examples of what, for whatever reason, the majority leader didn't want to bring up on this important legislation. We had amendments to make sure that the VA didn't get ahead of the science. You need to connect the science and the exposure to the disease. That's simple, that's what's expected. It's not simple, it's a complicated process, but it's just the rigor of a bill that you want to make sure those who are exposed and sick and with a disease are the ones who get the care. Right now in this bill, there are 23 respiratory illnesses and cancers that will be added to the list of presumptive ailments that will allow a veteran to be diagnosed with toxic exposure and qualify for benefits in any other disease the Secretary of the VA determines as warranted based on a positive association with certain substances, chemicals, or airborne hazards. Some of those 23 presumptives, as we're calling them, are based on science. Some aren't. I've asked the VA, I've asked the Secretary, hey, where do we get these 23? The answer I'm still waiting for. That's what the amendment process is for, Mr. President, to make sure this bill has rigor to take care of all veterans. Let me mention another amendment offered by Senator Moran, an amendment that he was promised to get a floor vote on but didn't happen, and I think would have made the bill stronger. It would have preserved the Trump-era gains on community care access standards and, importantly, serve as a relief valve for veterans to receive care as millions are going to be added into the system. So again, if you have 2.5 million additional claims and the VA is overwhelmed and now there's a giant backlog for everybody, this amendment would have said, well, the veterans in the system can go out and get community care. That's a good idea. It's actually how it works in Alaska, because we don't have a full-service VA hospital, one of only 3 states in the country. But that is a really smart idea, a safety valve. If the system looks like it's going to crater because it's overwhelmed, hey, let some doctors in town help the veteran. Couldn't bring that amendment up. So I pressed the VA Secretary on this, Mr. President, because I've seen it when a system collapses, and my veterans were really hurt in Alaska when it did, the VA system in my state. And I'm going to take his word for it now that the VA can handle 2.5 million more claims in the next 3 years. But I'm going to be watching like a hawk. Watching like a hawk in my oversight role. Like I said, there's nothing I care more about than our veterans, our military, their family members. We had the opportunity on an important bill that I will be supporting to make it better. And we sat in the Senate all week and didn't bring up one amendment to even try. The Secretary's assuring us, okay, all good, good to go. Well, some of us had ideas to make sure it would have been better to go. We couldn't bring them up. I hope there aren't problems with this implementation. If the system is in danger of collapsing as a result of this bill, I hope that whoever's majority leader at that time, 2, 3, 4 years from now, understands that the care for all veterans is what the VA is all about. And I hope, if we need it, we'll have the opportunity to bring good ideas to the Senate floor to fix these kind of things. Because, Mr. President, veterans are not a partisan issue in the Senate. They're not. I've seen it my whole career here. I sit on the committee. I sit on the Armed Services Committee. But for whatever reason, our ability in a bipartisan way to try to improve this bill that we're going to vote on tomorrow was not granted to other senators. And I think that's a missed opportunity, because I think we would have made this a better bill. I yield the floor.